My name is Jessica. I'm 34, and I thought this family dinner might be different. I hoped just maybe they'd see me as more than the one they could push aside, but nothing had changed. Mom looked right past me and told Dad she should start packing. They had no idea what was coming the very next day. The laughter carried across the table like smoke from the grill, light enough to drift, but heavy enough to sting. I sat at the far end of Richard Miller's long folding table paper plate, balanced on my knee, the scent of ribs and corn mingling with cut grass. They weren't laughing with me, they were laughing at me, and they didn't bother hiding it. Richard leaned back in his lawn chair, one arm hooked over the backrest, beer can in hand. "You know, Jess," he called loud enough for the cousins and two neighbors to hear, "most people your age are running their own homes by now. Some even own two." The punchline came with a grin aimed at the crowd, not me. A few chuckles rose up, polite at first, then warmer. Linda's voice slid in smooth, carrying the weight of a sideways jab. "She's busy," she said, eyes on her plate as she sliced Tyler a bigger piece of brisket. "Keeping that little apartment from falling apart takes a lot of energy." Her smirk was almost kind if you didn't know better. I let my fork hover the baked beans cooling on the tines. Margaret Lewis, sitting 2 seats away, didn't join in. She just sipped her iced tea, watching the exchange over the rim of her glass. Earlier, I'd set my homemade pie on the counter inside, warm, flaky crust, still fragrant with cinnamon. Maybe later, Linda had murmured, sliding it aside to make room for Tyler's plastic-wrapped cheesecake from the store. The pie sat there now, behind the screen door, condensation gathering under its wrap. A kid ran past my end of the table, nearly tipping my plate. I caught it just in time and settled back, half listening to Richard's retelling of my leaky faucet story, an old mishap from 2 years ago reimagined for better laughs. "She had buckets everywhere," he told them, grinning wide. "Looked like a game of musical chairs, only wetter." The crowd played along. Tyler cracked open another soda with a hiss and leaned back, shaking his head like I was some lovable but hopeless case. Margaret's eyes flicked toward me again, sharp and steady. I kept my gaze on my food, chewing slowly, nodding at the right beats. My hand stayed relaxed in my lap, even as my jaw worked harder than it should. The sun caught the edge of Richard's beer can, flashing light into my eyes. He squinted at me, then tossed the final line out like bait. "Jess, you're old enough to stand on your own right. Maybe it's time you stopped leaning on family." I set my fork down the metal tip, clicking softly against the plate. The laughter bubbled again, smaller this time, but enough to fill the space between us. I met his gaze across the table. No smile, no frown, just a slow, deliberate nod. Margaret's expression didn't change much, but her eyes told me she'd marked that moment. Behind me, through the mesh of the screen door, my pie waited untouched. A breeze moved through the yard, lifting paper napkins and the corner of the plastic tablecloth. Linda pinned it with a salt shaker, then looked past me as if I were part of the lawn furniture. "Ty, honey, do you want more corn?" She didn't ask me if I needed anything. I refilled my own water from the pitcher at the far end and passed it along when someone cleared their throat. Richard started another story, this one about how he taught me to change a tire when I was 19. He exaggerated the part where I stood on the wrench and nearly fell. People laughed before the punchline landed. I traced the sweating ring my cup left on the table, then wiped it with the edge of a napkin and tucked the soggy square under my plate to keep it from rocking. Jess, Tyler called from the good seats. "Did you bring the lemon bars this time, or just vibes?" He grinned at his own joke, reaching across Linda to snag the tongs. The metals scraped the aluminum tray. "I brought pie," I said, steady. "It's on the counter." "Oh," Linda answered lightly, eyes on the grill. "We'll see if anyone still has room." Across from me, Margaret dabbed the corner of her mouth with a paper napkin, then folded it carefully, half, then half again. She didn't smile or frown. She simply observed the space like a quiet referee. Kids shrieked near the sprinkler. Someone's phone began playing a tinny country song. The dog nosed at my ankle and then moved on. The world kept doing what it always does when someone is the butt of a joke it carried on. Richard lifted his beer again, catching the sunlight. "All in good fun," he said, directing it toward me. "You know how we love you, kiddo." The way he said love slid off the table like grease. I stabbed a cherry tomato. "Sure," I said, and let the word sit there. Linda tapped her watch face like she was checking steps. Speaking of grown-up things, she added to no one and everyone expenses have been wild. Gas, electric, you name it. It would be helpful if everybody who uses this house pitched in more. The sentence hung in the air casual as a weather report designed to sound reasonable. The neighbor couple nodded in sympathy. They didn't know the math behind our house, who'd been covering what who hadn't. They just heard the tone. I slid my chair back a few inches to make room for a child squeezing past with a plate. The chair leg caught a rut in the grass and stuck. I wiggled it free without scraping. Small movements, no clatter. Tyler lifted his phone and snapped a photo of the table, the kind that ends up on a story with stickers and captions. "Family time," he said. #blessed. He didn't point the lens at the far end where I sat. Richard stood to check the ribs, lifting the lid with a flourish as steam billowed. "Now this," he announced to claps, "is how you take care of your family." He sliced a rack and set the best pieces near his seat. When the platter made its way down to me, only end cuts and a ribbon of sauce remained. I took one, rinsed it in the pool of sauce, and didn't mention anything. Inside the screen door, my pie weighted fogged lid catching the light like a coin at the bottom of a fountain. Nobody reached for it. A bee traced slow circles around the lemonade pitcher and then drifted off. Jess Richard called again, softer this time, but still performative. "You know we just want what's best for you. Standing on your own 2 feet builds character." He gestured with the carving knife as if underlining a sentence. The blade flashed, then stilled. My fork paused mid-air. I set it down carefully. The table quieted by a degree, the way a room does when someone turns the volume down 1 notch but leaves the music playing. Margaret's gaze moved from Richard's knife to my face and back again, like she was following a rally no one else noticed. "Can you grab more ice?" Linda asked me, already turning away. She didn't wait for an answer. The cooler was across the yard beyond the adults and the folding chairs and the cluster of cousins. I stood, stepped around a tangle of flip-flops and lifted the lid. Cold air ghosted up my arms. I scooped ice into a plastic bowl, each cube clicking like a small clean yes. On my way back, I passed the counter where the dessert sat. Condensation had pooled under the pie plate and made a small wet ring on the laminate. I straightened the plastic wrap and set the plate on a dry square of paper towel without thinking about it. Old habit, fix what you can reach. When I returned with the ice, Richard cracked a joke about interest rates and starter homes you can actually afford if you don't mind the roof leaking. Laughter again, a practiced wave cresting and falling. I poured the ice into the pitcher and the lemonade brightened, sweating immediately. "Thanks," Linda said, already turned toward a neighbor with a story about Tyler's job prospects. As she spoke, she dragged my napkin closer to her side of the table, using it without noticing the faint red lipstick print on its corner that wasn't hers. The print rubbed off on her finger. She rubbed it away on the underside of the table. I sat back down, smoothed the damp tablecloth with my palm, and looked once more at Margaret. She didn't look away. There was no pity in her eyes. Just a calm, weighing patience, as if she were counting the beats of a song and knew exactly when the chorus would hit. A fly landed on the rim of my plate. I flicked it away gently. When the laughter rolled again, I didn't join or flinch. I let it pass over me like wind moving through tall grass, noisy, then gone, leaving the stalks upright. Richard set the knife down and reached for his beer. "To family," he declared. Everyone raised their cups. I lifted mine, touched the rim lightly, and drank. The lemonade was too sweet, but it went down clean. The yard smelled like charcoal and cut limes and sunscreen. The sun had shifted enough to put my end of the table in shade. I could see my reflection dull and wavy in the metal tray fork resting across it at perfect right angles. My hands were steady. They had been steady all afternoon. The afternoon sagged into that heavy quiet between courses where people picked at crumbs or refilled drinks just to keep their hands busy. Tyler leaned back, balancing his chair on 2 legs, tapping his soda can with a fingernail. The metallic tick-tick settled into the rhythm of the cicadas. I caught the low exchange between Richard and Linda, something about helping her stand on her own, their voices pitched in that careful way people use when they're pretending not to be overheard. Margaret's gaze slid past them, but I knew she'd caught it too. The kids had moved to the side yard, shouts muffled by the hedge. The absence of their noise made the table's conversations more distinct laughter, on one end, a half-serious debate about gas prices in the middle, and on my side, the scrape of a fork against an empty plate. Linda stood dusted off her shorts and disappeared inside. Through the screen door, I saw her glance at the pie, hesitate, then reach for the store-bought cookies instead. She brought them out with a bright dessert time and passed them around. Nobody asked about the pie. I took a cookie when the plate reached me, its edge soft from the heat. I broke it in half and let one piece rest in my palm crumbs, clinging like fine sand. Richard made a show of offering the last one to Tyler, then looked at me. "You good, Jess?" he asked, as if the entire afternoon hadn't been an answer already. "Fine," I said, and sipped water. The glass was warm now, the ice long gone. Somebody suggested a group photo. Chairs scraped back. People arranged themselves near the garden, taller ones in the back. I drifted toward the edge, not quite out of frame but not centered either. The camera flashed, catching a moment where my smile was polite, almost invisible. When the second shot came, I blinked on purpose. They'd probably crop me out. Afterward, people lingered in little knots talking about plans for the rest of the weekend. Tyler and Linda discussed a trip to the lake. Richard spoke to the neighbor about a contractor. I gathered paper cups and stacked plates, carrying them to the bin by the garage. Each toss made a soft, hollow sound. Margaret appeared beside me, holding a platter stripped of its ribs. "You all right?" she asked, her voice low enough not to carry. I looked at the platter at the streak of sauce in its center. "Just helping clean up," I said. She nodded once, no smile, just that measured patience again. "You're good at that." Back at the table, the lemonade pitcher was nearly empty, the slices of lemon pressed flat against the glass. I poured the last of it into my cup and took a slow sip. The sky had shifted to late afternoon gold shadows stretching across the lawn. Someone laughed at a joke. I couldn't hear the sound, breaking and scattering like a dropped plate. I set my cup down and folded my napkin neatly, pressing the creases with my fingertips. The laughter faded behind me as I stood and stepped toward the gate, the hinges groaning just enough to mark the moment. I didn't look back, but I could feel the hum of conversation resume softer now, as if they were conserving something without knowing why. The week after the BBQ slipped by with a steady hum of small obligations, work emails, grocery runs, the hiss of the kettle in the quiet kitchen. But beneath it all, a low current of unease lingered. The conversations from that afternoon looped in my mind, fragments replaying with the clarity of a scene I didn't ask to memorize. On Wednesday, I stopped by my parents' house to drop off some photos Margaret had taken at the party. Mom was in the kitchen, slicing peaches for a cobbler. The air was thick with cinnamon and something sharper, that mix of sugar and tension I remembered from holidays past. She looked up briefly, said, "Oh, Jess," and then her eyes drifted back to the cutting board. No hug, no invitation to sit. I set the envelope on the counter. "These are from Saturday." She wiped her hands on a towel and slid the photos out, fanning them across the counter. "Oh, that's nice," she murmured, but her gaze caught on one shot, the group photo where I'd stood at the edge, half in shadow. Her mouth pressed into a line. She didn't comment, just stacked the prints again and tucked them back into the envelope. Dad appeared in the doorway, rubbing the back of his neck. "Hey, kiddo," car holding up. The question was light, but it hung in the air like a placeholder for something else. I nodded, not mentioning the strange rattle I'd been hearing for weeks. If I did, I knew what would follow, an offer to have Tyler look at it. We made small talk. Or rather, they asked small questions and I offered smaller answers. I could feel the undercurrent of the BBQ still there, unspoken but saturating every word. When I left, Mom pressed a jar of homemade jam into my hands, the same way she used to send me home from college, with something practical, something edible, but never anything that carried weight. Friday night, my phone buzzed with a group text, a reminder about the Labor Day weekend plans. Tyler had offered his place for a big family cookout, plenty of room for everyone. The thread lit up with enthusiasm, people talking about who'd bring what games they'd play. My name didn't come up once. I stared at the screen for a while, watching the bubbles pop up and disappear. Finally, I typed, "Thanks for letting me know." No one responded directly, but a new message about potato salad came through seconds later. The omission was clear enough. On Saturday morning, I ran into Margaret at the farmer's market. She was holding a basket of herbs, the sunlight catching in her hair. "You're quiet," she said, tilting her head. "More than usual." I shrugged. "Family stuff." Her expression softened. Still the BBQ. I didn't answer, but my silence was answer enough. She reached into her basket, pulled out a small jar of honey, and pressed it into my hand. "Something sweet," she said. "You'll know when to use it." Later that afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table with the jar in front of me. The light caught in its golden depths, throwing tiny refractions onto the wood grain. I thought about the way people can occupy the same space yet live entirely separate experiences. How you can be in a group photo and still be invisible. Sunday brought a phone call from Mom. Her tone was clipped, almost businesslike. "Jess, your father and I have been talking. We think it's time you start planning more for yourself. You know, being responsible." I let her words hang there. Planning was a familiar code in our family. It meant stop leaning on us even if I hadn't asked for anything. It meant prove yourself worthy even if the bar kept moving. "Sure," I said finally. "I'll plan." She seemed satisfied with that and moved on to talking about her new book club. We ended the call without mention of the upcoming weekend. The absence of an invitation was its own message. That night I opened my laptop and began looking at listings. Not just apartments, but houses, small ones with worn porches and kitchens big enough for one person to cook without feeling watched. The kind of place where I could choose the lighting, the music, the company. Each click felt like a thread pulling me toward something I hadn't dared name yet. Not escape, not revenge, just space. As the week wore on, my resolve solidified. They didn't need to know the details. They'd see soon enough in a way that didn't require explanations or raised voices, a way that when it happened would change the texture of every conversation we'd ever had. The Thursday before Labor Day, I was at the grocery store when I saw Dad's truck parked outside the hardware store across the street. Through the window, I spotted him laughing with Tyler. They were leaning over a counter, pointing at something in a catalog. For a second, I considered walking in to say hello, but I stopped myself. This wasn't my conversation to interrupt, not because I couldn't, but because I knew exactly how I'd be received: polite, distant, an afterthought. That evening, I got a text from Aunt Linda. She'd just happened to mention to my mom that she might see me over the weekend. Mom's reply, which Linda pasted into her text, was short. "Oh, Jess has her own plans, I'm sure." I read it twice, my thumb hovering over the screen. My own plans. It was half a dismissal, half a shield. In my family, those words were a subtle way of saying, she's not part of this. Friday morning, the air felt heavier, thick with that late August humidity that makes you move slower. I decided to take the day off work, citing personal errands, though what I really needed was space to think without anyone else's voice crowding mine. I drove out to a neighborhood I'd been eyeing online, small tree-lined streets, houses with wide porches and gardens spilling over their fences. It smelled faintly of cut grass and warm pavement. The real estate agent, a woman named Cheryl, met me outside a small blue house with peeling shutters. She was brisk but warm, the kind of person who could make even bad news sound manageable. Inside the house smelled faintly of old wood and lemon cleaner. The living room had worn oak floors, the kind that creaked softly when you walked. I found myself trailing my fingers along the window frame, imagining curtains I might choose the way morning light would fall across a couch. "This one won't last long," Cheryl said. "Houses like this, people feel at home the second they walk in." I smiled faintly. "Yeah, I said I can see that." When I left, I didn't tell her I'd make an offer. I wanted that decision to be mine alone for a little while longer. Something private, unshared until the right moment. Saturday came with another group text photos of Tyler's yard being set up for the BBQ, folding tables draped in red and white checkered cloth, a cooler full of drinks, kids running across the grass. The kind of scene you'd see on a postcard for family values. I scrolled past without responding, then set my phone face down on the counter. That night, Margaret called. Her voice was low, steady. "So, you going tomorrow?" I let out a small laugh. Wasn't exactly invited. There was a pause. "You could still go." "I could," I said, "but I think I'd rather spend the day doing something that's mine." She didn't push. "Well," she said, "if you change your mind, you know where to find me." Sunday morning, I woke to the sound of distant church bells. The day stretched ahead unclaimed. I made coffee and drank it slowly on the balcony, watching the street below. Families walked by in twos and threes carrying covered dishes, kids in sundresses and collared shirts. The air was thick with grilled meat and laughter carried on the breeze. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to chase that sound. Instead, I opened my laptop and began typing up the offer for the little blue house. My hands were steady, my breath even. Each click of the keys was deliberate, a quiet declaration no one could overhear. By early afternoon, my phone buzzed with a call from Cheryl. "It's yours," she said. They accepted. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes for a moment. Outside, a neighbor's wind chime caught the faintest breeze, its notes soft and uneven, the kind of sound that doesn't demand attention but lingers if you're listening. I didn't tell anyone, not yet. Timing, I thought, was everything. Monday morning brought the kind of clear, crisp air that hinted fall wasn't far off. I went into work early, wanting to get ahead before the long weekend buzz wore off. My inbox was full, but my mind kept circling back to the blue house sitting quietly at the end of its tree-lined street. Around mid-morning, my phone lit up with a group message, a photo of Dad at the BBQ holding court at the head of the table. Tyler's wife had captioned it, "Best BBQ, yet everyone in the shot was mid-laugh, except there was a space where I knew I should have been." It wasn't intentional framing, but it was telling all the same. I stared at it for longer than I should have until the image began to feel flat, like a photograph in someone else's album. Margaret stopped by my desk at lunch, a coffee in hand. "So you survived the weekend?" she asked, leaning on the partition. I smirked. "You could say that." Her gaze sharpened. "You're not telling me something." I shrugged, unable to hide the small lift at the corner of my mouth. "Maybe." By the end of the day, Cheryl called again to confirm closing details. The papers would be ready within the week. I kept my answers clipped polite, not because I wasn't thrilled, but because the weight of what was coming needed the right moment to land. That evening, I drove by the house again. The porch light was on now, casting a soft golden glow across the front steps. I parked at the curb, engine off, and sat there for a while. In my family, houses weren't just places to live, they were statements. Who you were, what you had, where you belonged. And for the first time, I was making a statement no one else had shaped for me. Back home, I began quietly boxing up my apartment, nothing obvious yet, just the books I rarely touched, a set of dishes I didn't use often. Every piece I wrapped in newspaper felt like a step further from the version of me they thought they knew. By Friday, I'd arranged the move for the following week. The timing aligned with another family dinner, one I'd been left out of again. Perfect, I thought. Not out of spite, but because absence has a way of speaking louder than presence. On Saturday, as they all gathered around Tyler's table again, I was in my new kitchen peeling the tape off a box labeled Fragile. Outside, wind carried the smell of someone else's barbecue down the street. I let the scent drift past unclaimed. By nightfall, the house was quiet boxes stacked neatly in corners. I sat on the porch steps sipping tea, the glow from the living room spilling out behind me. Somewhere far off, a burst of laughter carried through the air, followed by silence. I stayed where I was, steady, knowing that soon the silence would no longer be mine alone. The following Sunday, the air was heavy with the smell of grilled meat and tangy barbecue sauce. Dad's backyard was full again, folding chairs in mismatched colors, the big cooler in the corner, kids chasing each other in the grass. I parked a little down the street, just far enough to see without being seen for the moment. They didn't know I'd be coming. Tyler was at the grill, spatula in hand, talking loudly to two of Dad's old friends. Mom was arranging the dessert table, her voice carrying across the yard. I could hear the laughter before I even stepped through the gate. When I finally walked in, the shift was almost imperceptible. Conversations paused just half a beat, eyes flicked toward me before looking away too quickly. I smiled politely, greeting people one by one, but didn't go to my usual seat. Instead, I stayed standing, letting them feel the small disruption of my presence. Dad came over, his expression tight, like he was trying to read why I was there. "Didn't know you'd make it?" he said, half question, half statement. "I wasn't sure I would," I replied, my tone even, "but I wanted to share some news." That earned me a few glances from the side, curiosity thinly veiled as disinterest. I waited until everyone had settled, plates in hand, before I spoke again. "I moved last week," I said, keeping my voice light. "Got the keys to my own place. Thought you should know." It was Tyler who bit first. "Oh, somewhere close." His words were casual, but the edge underneath was there. I nodded. "Close enough. Actually not far from here." Mom asked something about rent prices, her tone a little too bright, but I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a small stack of mail, the utility bills I'd been covering for Dad's house for years. I placed them gently on the table in front of him. "I'll be transferring these back to you starting next month," I said. "It just makes sense now." For a moment no one moved. The sound of the wind in the trees filled the gap. Then Dad's face shifted, not anger, not confusion, but something like realization settling in. Around the table the chatter stuttered into silence. I didn't elaborate. Didn't point out the years of quiet contribution, the times I'd stepped in without being asked. I simply stepped back, letting the weight of the gesture land on its own. From across the table, one of Dad's friends muttered, "Didn't know she was the one covering that." It wasn't loud, but it was enough. The ripple started there. Glances exchanged, forks set down mid-bite. I looked around, once my expression neutral. "Anyway, I should let you all enjoy your meal," I said, turning toward the gate. As I walked away, I felt the pause grow behind me, the kind of pause that meant something had shifted, even if no one said it out loud yet. I didn't need to see their faces to know. I didn't go straight to my car. Instead, I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, taking in the muffled sounds of the gathering. The laughter was quieter now, replaced by low voices. Through the gaps in the fence, I caught glimpses Dad still holding the stack of bills in his hands, staring at them as if the paper itself weighed more than it should. I took a slow breath and began walking, the late afternoon sun spilling across the street. A few steps later, I heard my name. I turned slightly to see Aunt Karen hurrying after me, her sandals slapping against the pavement. "Jessica," she said, a little out of breath. "I didn't know. All those years it was you." I gave a small shrug, not quite a smile. "It wasn't important to tell." Her eyes softened. "It was important. They just didn't see it." She glanced back toward the yard where the party still carried on in muted tones. "They will now." I thanked her, and she lingered for a second longer before returning inside. I kept walking until I reached my car, sliding into the driver's seat. The street was quiet here, just the distant hum of traffic. I sat for a while before starting the engine, replaying the scene in my head. There had been no shouting, no grand confrontation, just a shift, subtle but undeniable. The kind that leaves an echo. By the time I drove away, I knew they'd be talking about it long after I was gone. Dad would mention the bills again, maybe to Tyler, maybe to Mom. Someone would point out how often I'd been around without asking for anything. The details would piece themselves together, and the image they'd held of me would start to change. I passed the corner store, the same one I'd stopped at countless times after leaving their house in the past. This time I didn't go in. I didn't need the ritual of buying something to fill the space. The space was already full, with the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd done what I came to do. Back at my apartment, I placed my keys on the counter and glanced around. It was still sparse, still new, but it was mine. The evening light pooled across the hardwood floor, and for the first time in a long while I felt the edges of tension ease. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need a thank you. All I needed was what had happened today, the moment the truth sat in front of them, undeniable. That was enough. I woke up early the next day to sunlight flattening across the floorboards, a pale square of morning inching toward the boxes I hadn't finished unpacking. The house smelled faintly of coffee and lemon cleaner. I opened the back door and let the cool air in the screen, making a soft, springy sound as it settled. For a long moment I just stood there, barefoot, feeling the quiet sit around me like a well-fitted coat. By late morning, I drove over to drop off a set of spare keys with Cheryl's office and sign one last document. On the way back, I turned down Dad's street without deciding to. Habit more than intention. The yard still held the skeleton of yesterday's gathering, a folded chair left open near the hedge, a paper cup tipped on its side, the grill lid propped to cool. Through the open window, I heard low voices, not laughter. I didn't slow down. I didn't need to. At the next corner, I spotted Margaret walking her small terrier. She raised a hand and I pulled to the curb. The dog snuffled at the grass leash slack. So she said, studying my face with that same even gaze. How'd it feel? I thought about the way Dad's fingers had tightened around the envelopes, the way the room had rearranged itself, without anyone moving their chair. Light, I said. Quieter than I expected. She nodded once, satisfied. That's usually how truth sounds. We didn't speak for a while. The terrier shook once tags chiming. Margaret looked toward the house I'd just passed and then back at me. They'll be fine. She added, not as reassurance for them, but as a statement about the order of things. People learn fastest when there's no one to carry the weight for them. I smiled, a small one. I think I finally learned that too. She patted the roof of my car, a brief, friendly tap. Good. Then she started walking again, the dog trotting beside her tail, flicking like a metronome. At home, I rolled up my sleeves and baked the pie I'd wanted on the table for all those months. Same recipe, same cinnamon, different kitchen. When it was done, I set it to cool by the open window. The breeze lifted the curtain just enough to send the scent drifting out to the street. Sometime after 3, there was a single knock at my door, not urgent, not tentative. I opened it to find Mom on the step, hair pulled back, hands empty. She looked past me for a second like she was remembering the dimensions of the last place I lived and then refocused. I was nearby, she said, which we both knew wasn't true, words arranged neatly like place settings. She glanced toward the pie. You always did the crust right. I stepped aside. She didn't enter. She didn't need to. We stood in the doorway with the late light warming the threshold. I wanted to see you, she said finally, and her voice didn't try to lift anything it couldn't carry. And to say, we'll sort things out. I nodded, a small, steady movement. I know. We didn't make plans or revisit yesterday. She touched the doorframe once, like you do when leaving a room you want to remember, then lowered her hand. Take care, Jess. My name was even. Not clipped. Not stretched. Just placed. You too, I said. When the door closed, the latch made a clean sound, the kind that doesn't echo. I cut a slice of pie and set it on a plate, the triangle neat steam lifting in thin threads. I carried it to the porch and ate it there, watching a pair of kids ride their bikes down the street, the front wheel wobbling until it didn't. Somewhere, a lawnmower started, then stopped. The afternoon leaned toward evening. My phone buzzed on the side table, a text from Tyler, just 3 words, got your message. No punctuation. I didn't reply. A minute later, another text came from an unknown number, then a third from Dad that said, we'll handle it. I let the screen dim on its own. The sun slid lower, turning the tops of the trees the color of copper pennies. I rinsed my plate in the sink and set it in the rack. A small draft moved through the room and lifted the corner of the envelope still sitting on the counter. Not the bills, those were gone, the closing papers with my name printed in full. I pressed the flap down and smoothed it with the side of my hand. Before it got dark, I took a short walk around the block. Neighbors were out on their porches, ankles crossed, talking softly. A woman watered a row of tomatoes. A boy chalked a hopscotch grid that didn't run straight, but worked anyway. When I circled back, my living room lamp glowed through the front window like a lighthouse made for one. At the door, I paused and looked back down the quiet street, the sky now a deepening blue. I unlocked the deadbolt, turned the knob, and stepped inside. The door whispered against the jamb and settled into place with that same clean sound. I didn't say anything to the empty room. I didn't need to. The house held it for me, the shift, the space, the truth laid out where anyone could see it if they were standing in the right light. I set the keys in their dish. The room was still. Then, somewhere in the neighborhood, a fork clinked against a plate, and the sound carried thinly through the evening air, as if the day itself had decided to set something down. I sat, and the quiet stayed. Sometimes the loudest moment comes long after the room has gone quiet. You notice it in the way people pause before speaking your name, in the absence of certain questions, in the small spaces where dismissal used to live. And in those spaces without ceremony, you find yourself standing taller, not because anyone handed it to you, but because no one can take it back.